We'll be fighting in the street with our turbo at our feet. It's TurboWorks episode 14.
It just seems so stupid.
Capcom had a pretty interesting, if very unfriendly, TurboGrafx debut with sidearms. Now the company leads the way into that future I keep talking about with the first ever console game released on compact disc in America, Fighting Street. When the PC Engine CD-ROM debuted in December 1988, it was accompanied by 2 games on disc. Sold separately, of course. Japan doesn't do pack-ins. One of those games did not come to the US. Not only that, it had exactly 0 chance of being localized outside of Japan from the moment of its conception. Norico was a game that could only exist in Japan, but also a game that could only exist on CD-ROM. Norico gave Hudson its entree into the burgeoning console games about slightly popular teen idol singers scene that blew up in Japan after Sega revolutionized gaming with Teddy Boy Blues in 1985. Or more likely, Norico was Hudson's answer to Nintendo and Squaresoft's groundbreaking graphical adventure Nakayama Miho no Tokimeki High School. With that 1987 game, Nintendo looked at the murder mystery adventure format that Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken made popular and said, just this once, everybody lives. Rather than solve a brutal homicide, Tokimeki High School set players on a radically different sort of pursuit, a quest to win the heart of a new girl in class, who just happened to be trendy pop idol Miho Nakayama in disguise, as an everyday teen who just happens to be gorgeous and has a great set of pipes. Just as the popularity of Portopia on Famicom had kicked off its own entire category of games, you can largely trace back the origins of the dating sim genre to that hit Famicom Disk System game. Miho was patient zero of the format, and it just so happened to be a showcase for the Famicom Disk System. Tokimeki High School pushed the boundaries of available ROM space and allowed players to save their progress in wooing Miho's heart to disk. But that wasn't really why it was an FDS showcase. By the time it shipped in December 1987, Americans already had disk system-sized cartridges capable of recording data with a battery backup. What we did not have, however, were games that allowed you to take your saved progress to a handy, fax-equipped retail kiosk and upload your data to Nintendo in order to win prizes. Nintendo turned its Famicom Disk Kiosk distribution system into a cool interactive variant of the old Activision system where you could take a photo of a winning game screen and mail it away for an iron-on patch. Tokimeki High School allowed you to take that to an entirely new level by submitting your save data at a kiosk in order to enter a giveaway, whose chief prize was a special VHS cassette hosted by Miho herself, in which she hung out at shops, appeared at live events, and played a bit of Tokimeki High School. With Norico, developer Alpha System in turn took Nintendo's game and transformed it into a true, interactive, multimedia experience. Superficially, the game works like Tokimeki High School in the broad strokes. You interact with people through a menu and make small, low-stakes choices in order to navigate the game. But where Tokimeki High School was very much the classic image of a menu-driven adventure game, Norico greatly downplayed the gameplay and interactivity in order to focus on being a showcase for pop singer Noriko Ogawa, not to be mistaken for the present-day London-based classical pianist. Hudson's Ogawa of choice was just 15 years old when her video game showcase debuted, and had only just adopted Ogawa as her stage name the year before that. Ogawa had a minor hit song right out of the gate with Namida no Tabanete, Gathering Tears, and landed a few top 10 singles over the course of 1988. And Noriko treated her like the minor celebrity she was, as players began the game by attending a concert to watch her perform and then go on an age-appropriate date afterwards. The focus in Norico was entirely on the audio-visual appeal of spending an afternoon attending a concert and taking a pretty girl on a date. I suppose you could raise your eyebrows at the fact that Norico centers its content around a 15-year-old girl on a cutting-edge piece of technology that was priced for working adults rather than existing within the teenager allowance Goldilocks zone of the Famicom, but man, I don't think that's going to do anyone any good. The point is that Norico for PC Engine CD-ROM was only lightly interactive and poured its energy into exploiting the capabilities of the compact disc in order to feature Ogawa's music, her spoken dialogue, and lots of digitized photos of her. It's all extremely innocent and chaste. Idol singers of the 1980s were framed very much as existing somewhere between my sweet little sister and a precious doll to admire. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I do want to set the context here. We are a long way from suburban dads getting a little too into Slave for You here. Really, Norico was barely a step above a screensaver in terms of interactivity. Take out the handful of dialogue prompts and add a flying toaster and you've got yourself a very sweet, poppy version of After Dark. It's hard to imagine spending 5,000 yen, about $50 at the time, on this disc in the year of our Lord 2026, but in 1988, there was literally nothing like this game or game-adjacent product anywhere in the world. The CD-ROM era of the 1990s would see a flood of programs like this, ranging from the Make My Video series on Sega CD to Peter Gabriel's surreal immersive recording studio experience Explora 1. In 1988, however, the closest thing to experiencing the sights and sounds of Norico was to pop on a karaoke laserdisc, but the only interactivity those offered was as a platform for tormenting your friends with your singing voice. Norico was barely a video game, but it was more than video wallpaper, and it paved the way for countless creations over the coming decade, a true showcase for the new PC Engine add-on. Also, the same day that Norico debuted, NEC also published a fighting game from Capcom. Well, that was quite a shaggy dog tale, huh? Welcome home, Fido, good boy. Let's talk about Street Fighter. Fighting Street. No, I don't know why they swapped the words around in the title for the TurboGrafx CD release, but that was the case for the Japanese version, too. It appears to have been a dodge for trademark reasons, but hey, Americans got Mega Man and Dragon Warrior due to prior art locks on Rockman and Dragon Quest, so it's entirely possible. Regardless of the name, Fighting Street brings Capcom's landmark one-on-one fighting game home from arcades to consoles in respectable form. This was the only home console conversion of the original Street Fighter for nearly 20 years, when it finally started to make its way onto arcade compilations during the PlayStation 2 era. And it's a shame about that exclusivity because this version is pretty rough. The original Street Fighter was certainly a step or 5 below its sequel, but this plays like a step or 2 below that. Fighting Street allows you to play as the up-and-coming versions of fighting game superstars Ryu and Ken. Here, they play identically so far as I can tell, and their moves will be instantly familiar to the tens of millions of people who have played the sequels. The Street Fighter series didn't really take off until the sequel hit arcades in 1991, and playing it on TurboGrafx CD helps explain why. Not only is this version super rough, it's also tied to an underperforming piece of hardware. I feel like Sega Genesis could have handled this game about as well as the TurboGrafx CD, if not better. And I have to think that if Fighting Street had hit Genesis alongside Ghouls and Ghosts, it very likely would have had a lot more name recognition long before the sequel rolled around. That's not how history worked though, and that's fine. It actually supports my ongoing thesis that every Capcom game to appear on a non-Nintendo console was a pretty big deal in the 1980s. Sidearms was Capcom developing a TurboGrafx 16 game that demonstrated the sheer power of the system themselves, a sign that they saw which way the winds were blowing on consoles, at least in Japan. With Ghouls and Ghosts, they allowed Sega to create an exclusive conversion of their biggest moneymaker franchise at the time. And with Fighting Street, they granted Hudson the rights to an exclusive home conversion of an international arcade hit as an opening salvo for their new cutting-edge game hardware. Capcom was playing all sides, but they did it so tactically. Unlike Norico, I would call Fighting Street an edge case for the CD-ROM format. I don't know the exact file size of the game code here, but Fighting Street does feature 12 fairly large characters fighting against 10 different illustrated backdrops and a couple of elaborate bonus stages. You probably could have squeezed all of this onto a turbo chip if you really wanted to. Heck, Fighting Street had to be compromised to work within the TurboGrafx CD's limitations anyway. Significantly so. The arcade Street Fighter moved pretty smoothly, even if the characters lacked the grace and variety of skills that we would come to expect from fighting games in the 90s. But this port evokes expressions like slideshow. The characters move choppily, and there's pretty serious delay between inputting a command and Ryu performing it. This gives the CPU opponents, which is all of them except Ken in a 2-player match, a huge advantage over you, as if they didn't have enough already from the wildly unbalanced damage values. You know how Ryu is perpetually on a training mission to become a better fighter? I'm pretty sure that motivation comes from the fact that he is literally the most pathetic martial artist in the world in this game. Even focusing on strong attacks, which are tough to count on when the game moves so sluggishly that you find yourself button mashing in hopes of getting priority over opponents, he has to pound enemies repeatedly in order to take them out. By contrast, just about everyone can wipe the floor with Ryu in 4 or 5 hits. It also suffers from other lesser issues. The backgrounds for each stage have a lot less visual detail than in the arcade, for example. That's standard practice for 1980 console conversions, I know, but we've seen some pretty fantastic stage visuals on TurboGrafx-16. The console absolutely could have given us, for example, the wispy cirrostratus clouds that trail into the sunset over Mount Fuji and Geki stage, or the arcade game's more elaborate version of the Great Wall, while facing Lee in China. But alas, that memory bandwidth. Although it doesn't load as sluggishly as Neo Geo CD fighters would, Fighting Street really suffers from the system's single-speed CD drive. I would posit that most of the time the average person spends with Fighting Street involves watching the console load data, whether overtly, like the round announcement cards, or in more subtle ways. Each battle starts with the characters automatically walking quite slowly into the arena, and after every match you have to listen to a fanfare and a voice clip play out. Elements that you can't skip past, and are clearly meant to mask data access and loading behind quote-unquote presentation. So what good does the CD-ROM format bring to the table for Fighting Street? For better or for worse, this arcade version sets the standards for a whole lot of CD-based software to come throughout the 16-bit era. It's a game with perfectly normal-looking 16-bit graphics and a stunningly crisp soundtrack. In fact, Fighting Street features all new arrangements of the arcade game's soundtrack. Rather than utilizing the TurboGrafx-16's audio chip to generate music, Fighting Street accompanies the action with studio recordings of the coin-op tunes. Again, these are new arrangements. The easy approach would have been to just stick an audio tap on the arcade board and record music directly from the machine in order to create arcade-perfect sound. But developer Alpha System chose to record all new studio renditions of every tune. According to VGMDB, Street Fighter's music was composed by Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, aka Yuki-chan's papa of Mega Man and Mega Man 2 fame. The Turbo CD arrangements were handled by a duo called Shofuku, which was also the moniker Yasuhiko Fukuda and Noritaka Ubukata used for their custom Yamaha DX7 synthesizer patch. As a CP system game, Street Fighter's arcade version generated its music through the board's Yamaha YM2151 chip, an FM synthesizer capable of generating 8 voices with 4 operators apiece. The DX7 was a more powerful synth, whose capabilities made it a mainstay of pop music. It could produce 16 voices with 6 operators per voice. In other words, Shofuku took the tunes of the arcade version and gave them a glow-up on a dedicated pro-grade synthesizer capable of creating a wider and more subtly nuanced range of sounds. And you can hear the difference with a simple comparison. The arcade version has the slightly ragged, muffled quality common to most arcade FM synths in the late 80s, while the TurboGrafx CD arrangements have cleaner sound and far better clarity and separation between the digital instruments. This would become, again, more or less the standard for CD-era game soundtracks. Studio recordings made with superior synth sequencing, or sometimes even live band or orchestra recordings. Of course, as impressive as pre-recorded audio sounds compared to chiptunes or consumer-level FM synth, it does have its drawbacks. CD-quality audio always feels a little detached from the actual game when it's running 16-bit graphics. Maybe someone without a ton of video game experience wouldn't notice, but when you play a game that looks a certain way, you expect it to sound a certain way. And that gives Fighting Street and the minigames that followed its example a slight touch of the uncanny valley. Also, unlike chiptunes, CD audio tracks have hard stops and starts. And even a fast drive will have a small delay or hitch when jumping to the next track if they're not simply running through the track index. If a game stage takes longer to complete than the track that accompanies it, there will always be a gap before the tune loops, since the laser has to jump back to the start of the track, something that affects even masterpieces like Rondo of Blood. That said, it's not really a problem here. When every match maxes out at 90 seconds and you probably get pasted in about 20, it's pretty trivial to make sure that every combat tune simply runs longer than that. So Fighting Street manages to avoid a lot of the issues that would prove endemic to the CD-ROM format. But aside from the music and a handful of voice clips, Fighting Street doesn't do that much to demonstrate the potential of this new tech. And maybe it didn't have to. We can criticize a lot about Fighting Street in hindsight, but let's be honest, hearing music this good come out of a video game system is pretty incredible in 1989. Console games had gone from background static and simple single-channel ditties to studio-grade performance in the space of a decade, a level of technological advancement far more rapid than anything gaming has managed to muster in our past decade. And it was pretty impressive to hear voice samples that consisted of more than an indecipherable 3-second clip. Even if those voices did all say the same thing after each match, in the same voice, and clearly not one belonging to a native English speaker.
Listeners, don't forget the Americans are all over the world.
For all the ups and downs of this conversion, I do see some symbolic significance in this particular title being the launch game for NEC's CD-ROM format in both Japan and the US. The CD-ROM would revolutionize video gaming in the 1990s, and the original Street Fighter set the foundation for what would turn out to be the world's most popular genre in the 1990s. So in 1989, at the cusp of a new decade, it really didn't get more glimpse of the future than Street Fighter on TurboGrafx CD. Fighting Street. In a lot of ways, VideoWorks has been building up to this moment for more than a decade itself. The road to Fighting Street began way back in the early days of NES Works when Nintendo localized Irem's Kung Fu for Famicom and NES. The lead designer behind Kung Fu, Takashi Nishiyama, would go on to head up the design of Street Fighter. Along the way, he not only created Trojan, but also sparked a dozen imitators, including Fist of the North Star, Kung Fu Kid, Bad Dudes, Fist of the North Star, and Vigilante. Nishiyama has said that he took inspiration for Street Fighter from a variety of sources, including real-life martial arts and the genre flicks of the 70s, like Enter the Dragon. Fighting Street was hardly the first video game to focus on one-on-one martial arts competitions. Data East's Karate Champ hit arcades around the same time as Kung Fu, and more fantasy-tinged interpretations like Yar Kung Fu and Flying Dragon became pretty popular on Famicom. However, the fact that Nishiyama designed Fighting Street set it apart from its predecessors. Nishiyama had always given a lot of thought to positioning and space in his games, even the auto-scrolling sci-fi shooter Moon Patrol. Kung Fu allowed players to attack with both punches and kicks. The former launched quickly but had poor range, while the latter deployed more slowly yet provided greater reach. Protagonist Thomas could attack from a standing, crouching, or leaping position, giving players plenty of options with which to deal with the different threats he faced. There were warriors who moved in quickly to crowd Thomas, dwarves who could only be struck with a crouching attack but who liked to leap unpredictably to attack from above, knife throwers who attempted to stay out of Thomas's reach while harassing him with ranged projectiles, non-human enemies who moved with more unconventional patterns, and bosses who combined all the worst attributes of the standard mooks. Completing Kung Fu required players to develop quick reflexes and an instinctive sense of how to deal with each type of threat and how to manage different enemy patterns in combination simultaneously. Trojan built on this formula by adding weapons and defensive maneuvers, and it also added, uniquely for the Capcom-developed NES port, a two-player arena battle mode, which is to say, a fighting game built around Nishiyama's combat principles. The Trojan arena mode on NES was pretty basic and only allowed two identical characters to fight. But damn it, I am convinced that that game, which shipped for Famicom nearly a year before Street Fighter debuted in arcades, was Nishiyama's dry run for the real thing. Street Fighter and Fighting Street takes all the player capabilities and strategic considerations of Kung Fu's scrolling combat and condenses them into a showdown format in the style of Trojan's NES Arena. The 10 opponents you face in Fighting Street generally use the same techniques and gimmicks as the enemies you fought in Kung Fu, but in a one-on-one context that allows your foes to combine those techniques in interesting ways. For example, Mike the Boxer relies almost entirely on powerful straight punches, while Geki the Ninja uses smoke bombs to warp around while attempting to stay out of your reach and pepper you with shuriken. Birdie loves rushing punches and leaping overhead strikes. And Adon the Muay Thai kickboxer really loves his flying kicks. Although your combat options are a whole lot more limited here than in later Street Fighters, so don't bother charging up your meter to unleash a V'ism, Ryu and Ken are at least more capable martial artists than, say, the dope in Yar Kung Fu, even if this port does them no favors. Maybe Trojan opened Nishiyama's eyes to the fact that games are more fun when the player has a wide array of options at their command, including defense, because Fighting Street gives you access to a few secret moves that can help even the odds. In addition to commanding the same set of basic kick and punch attacks as Thomas, Ryu and Ken can also execute 3 advanced moves. There's the Hadouken, a chi-powered projectile that flies partway across the screen and allows you to hit foes outside of your melee range. There's the Shoryuken, a special uppercut attack that sends you flying vertically and gives you a great counter against enemies who like to jump. And finally the the Hurricane Kick, a spinning forward kick strike. These skills are almost impossible to execute, especially in the Turbo version, a port where every move is difficult to execute. Admittedly, these skills are almost impossible to execute, especially in the Turbo version, a port where every move is difficult to execute. Like its sequel, Fighting Street featured a 6-button panel in arcades, while the TurboGrafx originally had a paltry 2-button controller. Happily, there was a fairly simple solution for this issue at hand, built right into the coin-op legacy. Many Street Fighter cabinets had featured only 2 buttons, a pair of oversized rubber pads that housed pressure-sensitive inputs. In that iteration of the machine, the harder you hit a pad, the harder the corresponding attack. A novel and noble attempt, but not all that well received, hence the 6-button setup for the cocktail cabinet and subsequent sequels. Alpha System simply interpreted pressure as time for its home conversion, tying the force of an attack to the duration of the player's button press. Tap a button, and you'd perform a quick kick or punch. Give it a good, hard, lingering press, and you'd execute a more powerful action. SNK would borrow this concept a decade later for its Neo Geo Pocket conversions of their arcade fighting games, conversions that were, in fact, produced by Nishiyama. So Fighting Street gives you control of Ryu, or Ken if you use a cheat code, and allows you to take on 10 opponents in whichever order you'd like. There are 4 locales through the world, and 2 opponents to defeat in each: USA, Japan, China, and the UK. Once you've cleared those areas, it's on to the final bosses in Thailand. Along the way, you can participate in a couple of bonus stages where you karate chop cinder blocks in front of a crowd at a pagoda, then kick boards in front of an Edo-era tiger painting. Some opponents here were more inspired than others. You can tell which was which because they actually showed up in sequels. Ryu and Ken went on to become mainstays of the series, along with final boss Sagat, who canonically loses here because Ryu sucker punches him with a Shoryuken that leaves a massive scar across his chest. Balrog, whose name was M. Bison in Japan, seems like he was probably meant to be this game's Mike, but names have been changed to protect the innocent and Capcom's legal claim to plausible deniability. A few others, including Adon, Birdie, Gen, and eventually even Eagle, showed up in the Alpha Interquel series set between Fighting Street and Street Fighter II. Even nobodies like Lee and Retsu have popped up in the series lore from time to time. Heck, the utterly forgettable generic brawler Joe, whose only notable trait is that he is probably the guy fighting on the title screen of Street Fighter II, is slated to appear in the upcoming Street Fighter movie. So, long story short, Fighting Street would have had a significant place in gaming lore, even if this version had never happened. The fact that this game helped launch the most advanced and future-facing peripheral of the 1980s totally seals it, though. This is a real landmark of video game history. Did Fighting Street need to be a CD-ROM game? Probably, given the number of characters and arenas, but it might have been more fun as a compromised chip port. I'd happily trade a few characters or backdrops in return for smoother animation and more responsive controls. It's worth noting that a port of Street Fighter II shipped in 1994 as the last truly noteworthy PC Engine card release. A bloated, super thick chip that contained a bunch of memory management circuitry that enabled the card to contain a flabbergasting 2.5 megabytes of data. That wasn't an option in 1989, of course, so Fighting Street is simply a middling conversion of a minor arcade hit that shipped on a cutting-edge medium, primarily so that you could enjoy an absolutely sizzling rendition of Yuki-chan Papa's soundtrack, which, as justifications for landmark innovation go, wasn't too shabby, really.
I have good fortune.
Next time on TurboWorks, we have our final release for 1989. Can you guess which genre it belongs to?